those are my students who know that I'm going to be grading their papers very soon. So. Suck it up. My name is Bill Cavanaugh. I'm the director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology here at DePaul. And really, I want to thank you for coming out, especially because the Cubs, I know, are playing tonight, but you decided to come here and learn about a different kind of suffering than what the Cubs are up to. So, but maybe they'll pull it out. Maybe they'll pull it out. We'll see. This talk tonight is the second part of our series that we have going on this year on the Corporal Works of Mercy. The Corporal Works of Mercy are a traditional Catholic devotion about different ways of serving the poor, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting the prisoner, ransoming the captive, and so on, based on Matthew 25, where Jesus says, whenever you did this to the least of my brothers and sisters, you did this for me. So last time we talked about refugees and the migration crisis. Tonight we have Chris Herlinger to talk with us about feeding the hungry and giving drink to the thirsty. Speaking of which, there is plenty of food, so please help yourself to that, and and give thanks for the abundance of food that we have here. But we're going to talk about food insecurity tonight as well. And there's no better person than Chris Herlinger to lead us into that discussion. Chris is the author of 4 books, including this one most recently, Food Fight, Struggling for Justice in a Hungry World. And he's one of the leading experts on the question of food policy and food insecurity. This is the third in a trilogy. And it's available on Amazon and other places, or directly from the publisher if you're interested. But Chris is an author who has written for many different publications: the Huffington Post, Christian Century, the Harvard Divinity Bulletin, National Catholic Reporter. And his main position is an international correspondent with the Global Sisters Report, which is a project of the National Catholic Reporter, and talks about a lot of the amazing things that nuns are doing around the world, and deals more generally in humanitarian efforts. And so he has lots of frequent flyer miles, I imagine, has been all around the world, and is able to kind of make some of these links between what's going on in different parts of the world for us. So please join me in welcoming Chris Herlinger.
First, Bill, thank you for that very warm welcome. I was telling you earlier that you have a great staff, and I appreciate the warmth and reception I've received today. So thanks very much for that. Also, thanks to you on this auspicious night. I've been in Chicago 24 hours. I was telling people I was born in Pittsburgh, grew up in Denver, went to college and lived in Minnesota, and now live in New York. So my baseball loyalties are very divided. And it's nice to come to a place where there's absolutely no question about where the loyalties are.
Careful.
What? Well, I know there's another team. I'm referring to the. I think I'm referring to the neighborhood, the immediate neighborhood. And we'll try to be brief. I mean, I know people probably want to go and watch the game, but we do have some important things to talk about. I'm going to talk about hunger. Hunger is ubiquitous. It afflicts those in noisy, crowded cities and quiet, forgotten villages. It hides in plain sight. It does its work quietly and insidiously. It gnaws and burrows into the lives of the poor in New Mexico and into the lives of the poor in Indonesia. It harms the lives of those who toil in kilns in rural Pakistan and of those who work in the shadow of Wall Street. Hunger's faces are our faces. The 9-year-old girl in Nairobi who proudly wears a blue school uniform and eats but once a day, yet is tired by day's end. The infant in Moldova, wrapped in blankets, but already stunted due to lack of nourishment. The 7-year-old in rural Colorado, whose only meal at home is at breakfast pork rinds and crackers, and who is asleep at his school desk by 1 in the afternoon. Hunger takes, it steals, it coils, it robs, it diminishes us, it haunts and stunts us, it reduces us. And yet its ultimate dirty secret is this: it needn't do any of these things. It could, given enough political will and human agency, be ended for good. It needn't claim, it needn't maim, it needn't decimate, it needn't destroy, it needn't triumph over hope. It can be stopped. It should be stopped. But will it be stopped? I have to confess that when I got the very gracious and unexpected invitation to speak at DePaul, under the theme, The Works of Mercy in the Age of Crisis, I was a little taken aback. I'm a journalist, and despite Bill's kind words, I'm not an expert on hunger, although I've written about it. And the book I co-authored in 2015 with Paul Jeffrey called Food Fight, Struggling for Justice in a Hungry World didn't exactly top the charts of bestsellers. And then there's the fact journalists or authors should be honest about. Usually when a project is done, be it a long piece or a book, we tend to put the subject aside. The case of Robert Caro, who has spent 30 plus years writing about President Lyndon Johnson in 4, soon to be 5 volumes, is the odd anomaly. Makes me wonder, doesn't Caro wake up some mornings and say, I'd rather write about Jimi Hendrix, or Star Trek, or 15th century theology? And so I have to confess that having done about a year's project on the subject of hunger, actually more than a year since the reporting for the book took place over a longer stretch of time, I put the subject of hunger out of my mind for a while. And yet as I moved from a job of writing about humanitarian issues from the inside for an aid group, to being a full-time staff writer for National Catholic Reporter and Global Sisters Report, the subject of hunger kept trailing me, and it hasn't let go. Why is that? Because hunger is so much a part of the reality of the world. And it is a very real problem that those who work in the highly connected world of humanitarian work in the Catholic world, a web that includes parishes and dioceses, religious congregations of both men and women, and such respected groups and networks like Catholic Relief Services, Caritas, and Jesuit Refugee Service, they have to contend with this day in and day out. Now, I'll have more to say about that in a bit, but for now, let me just underline that anyone who writes about the problems of the world ultimately comes up against the problem of hunger. Here's one example. Early in 2015, I heard from a priest I had interviewed the year before doing a reporting assignment in South Sudan for National Catholic Report. He told me that some of those he knew who had fled during political violence had died of hunger. Died of hunger. When I heard this, my heart sank. Crises like those in South Sudan often cause food and food assistance to be cut off. But it also drives people from the productive lands, so they can't feed themselves. Food is something a lot of people generate and produce, not just something they receive during emergencies. Whatever the cause, it is nevertheless unconscionable, even during war and conflict, that people die of hunger. But the story is not just about people dying of hunger. It is about living with hunger. In my work for NCR and Global Sisters Report in the last year, I've been to 2 remarkably tough, but still resilient countries, South Sudan and most recently Haiti. I just returned from Haiti a couple weeks ago. In both places, I asked people I interviewed if they are hungry. The question usually came up when meeting a group of people. And people would inevitably raise their hand and answer, yes, I'm hungry. But sometimes I didn't even have to ask the question. In my assignment that I finished last month, I interviewed a young man who had survived last year's Hurricane Matthew in Haiti. Boyer Jean Odlin is a smart, ambitious 28-year-old who speaks English well and has a college degree that would prepare him for a good administrative position. In the parlance of our country, Boyer would be considered a go-getter. But in Haiti's shaky economy, he's been unable to find work, real work, and gets by on occasional day jobs. Boyer is still struggling to find his way in the wake of Hurricane Matthew, which severely damaged the small room he rents in the coastal city of Le Cay. He is also a friend of a Haitian colleague and friend, and when the three of us sat down for a meal after I interviewed him last month, I had no doubt that he had not eaten in a few days. I asked as sensitively as I could about that, and he said yes, there were days he eats little or barely anything at all. That still has the power to anger me, but in the end it really isn't that surprising. Haiti remains a vulnerable country not only because it is a Caribbean country that must brace itself from September through December, roughly 1/3 of the year, from tropical hurricanes. But more to the point, it remains impoverished, and that places a special burden on those like the young man I interviewed, in a constantly precarious position, day to day. The same can be said about South Sudan, the world's newest country, but a place of enormous challenges. It went from a place trying to achieve independence from its neighbor to the north, Sudan, and did so, but at great human cost. But since independence in 2011, South Sudan has had the misfortune of being led by national leaders who unfortunately have forsaken national unity for political power, exploiting ethnic difference for political gain. The result is a new civil war that has cost tens of thousands of lives and has caused more than 1 million people to flee their homes, either within South Sudan itself or to neighboring countries. The resulting displacement has made it impossible for farmers to continue farming, exasperating an already delicate situation for food. Now, the South Sudanese government says the problem is famine caused by drought. Now, drought has a big part to play in this, and no doubt climate change has a part in that as well. But when people have to flee their source of food and livelihood because of a civil war, famine is bound to be the result. But let's underline, the conflict is what is causing this. Now, Pope Francis, who is to be applauded for consistently being on point about the issue of hunger and how it is interrelated to other problems, said earlier this month that food insecurity, and by that we mean the lack of stable access to food, is linked to forced migration. The two can be addressed, Francis said in a report reported by National Catholic Report, only if we get to the root of the problem. This is the Pope speaking now. Only if we get to the root of the problem. And that includes both conflict and climate change. The NCR report about the Pontiff's appearance at the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is based in Rome, said this. The Pope said, international law already has all the instruments and means in place to prevent and quickly end the conflicts that tear communities and countries apart and trigger hunger, malnutrition, and migration. Goodwill and dialogue are needed to stop conflicts, he said, and it is necessary to fully commit to gradual and systematic disarmament, as well as stop the terrible plague of arms trafficking. What good is denouncing that millions of people are victims of hunger and malnutrition because of conflicts if one does not effectively work for peace and disarmament? As for climate change, he said, scientists know what needs to be done, and the international instruments like the Paris Agreement already are available. Without specifying which nations, the Pope said, unfortunately some are backing away from the agreement. Okay, we know who he's referring to there. As we know, President Trump announced in June that the United States would withdraw from the accord as a way to help the U.S. economy. Francis said we cannot resign ourselves to saying someone else will do it. Everyone is called to adopt and promote change in lifestyle, in the way resources are used, and in production and consumption, particularly when it comes to food, which is increasingly wasted. The Pope also said that international organizations, leaders, and individuals need to act out of real love and mercy toward others, particularly the most vulnerable, in order to create a world based on true justice and solidarity. I commend the Pontiff for making this a priority and for stating what may seem obvious but needs to be restated. The issues of hunger, peace, and justice are all interrelated and need to be treated as such. You are lucky here at DePaul in being part of a proud tradition of conscience and action and part of an international network of Catholic humanitarians that includes humanitarian groups, parishes, dioceses, places of education, and a special place for me now, because I cover the work of Catholic sisters, congregations, both men and women, doing fine work throughout the world. If there's any message I have for the young idealistic students I know here, or here in the audience tonight, it is that working for peace and working to fight hunger go hand in hand. Do one or do both, but whatever you do, do it, and the world can be a better place. Now let me turn now to the experience of Haiti and South Sudan as test cases for the challenge of feeding the hungry. And let me first say, like many journalists, I'm not a numbers person. But we have to acknowledge that while we can drown in numbers, numbers provide a context. I'll try to be brief with these. And the sources you're going to see, the sourcing on the slide is from the World Food Program, which, like the FAO I just mentioned, is one of the food-related organizations of the United Nations. Okay, first Haiti. Can you all see it? I don't think there's any need to go over this point by point, but this is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. 3/4 of Haitians live on less than US $2 a day, and half of the population earns less than $1 a day. I think, as everyone knows, particularly after the devastating earthquake that hit the country in 2010, these issues of poverty have been exacerbated by natural disasters over the last 2 decades. 50% of the country is undernourished. 59% of people live in poverty, and nearly 25% in extreme poverty. Ten 10% of the richest Haitians possess 70% of the country's total income. That's one of the most uneven balances of income in the world. And again, to repeat, 50% of urban Haitians are unemployed. South Sudan, independence since 2011. That was a very profound marker. Day of independence, celebration. People like Hillary Clinton were there. It was something that the world was very happy about. And yet, even at that point, the newest country of the world was already one of the least developed. The fighting in the Civil War I've been referring to spread rapidly from the capital of Juba in 2013. A peace deal signed in August 2015 has yet to be implemented. The conflict has uprooted more than 2.3 million people. Now that's out of a population of almost 12 million. That's a substantial number of people who've been displaced in this war. .5% of children under the age of 5 are underweight. And even before the current conflict, and this has gotten worse because of the displacement, a little over 50% of the population already live below the poverty line. So with over 1 million people, actually 2 million, forced from their homes, the conflict is reversing some of the progress that had been made recently. That's actually a theme that we'll return to in a bit. Now, as far as my own reporting, let me address Haiti first. That's a country I know better than South Sudan. I've been there 5 times since 2010, the earthquake, and a country I dearly love, even though it can be a tough, very daunting place to work. When I visited Haiti last year, I met with Brazilian sister Renata Lopez, who spoke quietly, almost shyly, when reflecting on the conditions of Wharf Germel. This is the area, a community located near Port-au-Prince's port area. But her words carried weight and worry. There are many, many problems here. Lack of good water, lack of electricity, and hunger, said the sister, who works with a group of Brazilian women and men religious known as Mission Benem. Crime is endemic in the area, so much so that even the United Nations peacekeeping forces are wary of coming to this low-lying zone of small shacks, unpaved roads, and trash-cluttered canals like this canal you're seeing here. But the hunger problem is probably the most difficult, she said. Why hunger specifically? Because most of the people don't work, and if they don't work, there aren't enough meals in a day, she said. They can't manage the situation with their families. Another sister I met and interviewed, Merci Christ Samaron, a Haitian member of the Sisters of Providence, agreed with her Brazilian counterpart. Why is Haiti so poor? Because people don't have jobs, they don't work. Now the answer may seem obvious, no work, no food, just as I said about the young man I interviewed. And yet it reveals a fundamental truth about Haiti, the poorest country in the Americas. Endemic poverty has made the country chronically hungry. To reiterate the numbers, nearly 2/3 of Haitians live in poverty, according to the World Food Program. And nearly a quarter of the country lives in extreme poverty. That makes getting food on the table a huge struggle in Haiti. More than 50% of Haitians are undernourished. And I'm not alone in saying that the refrain of "I am hungry" is common throughout the country. It's something that sisters like Lopez hear constantly, day in and day out. That is why the mission efforts with large and small feeding people is a key part of what sisters in a variety of congregations do in Haiti. On the southern coastal city of Jacmel, the work of Felician sisters marrying Morko, seen here, she's originally from Poland, and American sister Marilyn Marie Minter includes serving meals as part of a community-based after-school program for about 60 children. It is inconceivable not to have a feeding program given the needs, said Morko. We use everything we get for the children, she said. As a cook working with the sisters, served heaping plates of rice and beans to a group of children. In the case of Mission Bolem in Port-au-Prince, 5 sisters and 3 Catholic brothers, work means regularly providing meals to about 850 children on a regular basis, 3 times a day, most days. The program is aimed at infants and children attending school up to the age of 16. And funding for the program is provided by USAID, the U.S. government's development arm, and by the Florida-based humanitarian organization, Food for the Poor. Breakfast is cornmeal porridge. Later in the day, ready-made food packages are prepared to provide a mixture of rice, proteins, dehydrated vegetables, and vitamins. One of the students I met, 14-year-old Odine Jean Baptiste, said the feeding program has eased the pressure on her family of 8. As a long school break was ending, she was eager to return to school in September, and not only for the breakfast and lunches provided. I just want to get back and learn more, she said. Lopez, like a lot of the sisters I have met, acknowledge that there are limits to what they and their missions can do. There aren't, for example, resources to feed other family members who could use the food, such as mothers. That points to a bald fact in Haiti. Probably even thousands of small-scale efforts to feed Haitians, particularly children, are really substitutes for what should happen. Government-funded programs that could potentially reach many more. The government should be resolving this problem, Lopez told me. As it is, she and the other sisters are only doing just a bit, of what a government with real clout and commitment could do. Lopez is not alone in expressing frustration. Anglican Bishop Augué Bouvier, the executive director of Food for the Poor's Haiti operation, told me, it's a mess. It's a mess. We are trying to patch together what we can do. But in a country where infrastructure is weak, the reach of the government is limited, and less than 5% of Haitians even pay taxes to fund government expenses, there's only so much that small-scale programs, essential as they are, can do. A government without taxes is crippled, said Bouvier. Now, an interesting thing happened between my interview with Bishop Bouvier last year and an email exchange just a few weeks ago. Haiti elected a new president in 2016, late 2016, November. His name is Jovenel Moïse, and he has made agriculture a priority for his administration. The young president, he's only 49, before he became president, helped found a free trade organization zone, including a banana plantation, and that earned him the name during the election, Banana Man. Now, Bishop Bouvier, someone I like and trust, he's a strong believer in the need for Haiti to become agriculturally self-sufficient. He believes that the new president is headed in the right direction. The bishop told me, in a country where food is already scarce in some localities, a revival of the farming sector is a necessity. and can lead to real change in the lives of many people. President Mosi's commitment to the farming sector is a great step towards development. If undertaken well, it will lead to great improvement of standard of living for a population who desperately needs it. Now, the operative phrase here, I think, is undertaken well. The problem is that if Haiti turns to a model that emphasizes big agriculture, it could sacrifice whatever security small farmers in rural areas have in feeding their families. And already the new president has run up against some problems. When I was in Haiti just a few weeks ago, street protests against the president's decision to increase taxes on things like passports were becoming common, tying up traffic and endangering safety on roads. In fact, my driver and I had to return to the capital, Port-au-Prince, because it was not safe to travel on a roadway near the border with the Dominican Republic. We saw young men burning tires and throwing rocks at trucks. It was time to get out of there. So let's return to the question of political leadership. Haitians and the Catholic sisters I met involved in anti-hunger and anti-poverty efforts fought government corruption and bad leadership for much of what ails Haiti. Ask Haitians about lingering problems of poverty and hunger, and talk inevitably returns to poor political leaders. There are no real leaders in Haiti, and the ones we have are corrupt, said Correlian Therese Molocone, a member of a women's self-help group in Port-au-Prince that is organized by a group of sisters, the Missionary Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, or ICM sisters. When I spoke to Molocone a few weeks before last year's presidential election, she said not much was likely to change. A long tradition of Haitian politicians using office for personal gain, both for themselves and their families, is hard to shake. It won't change, she said. Even if a good man is elected president, those around him won't change. Now, electoral politics are not the only impediment. In a country where the unemployment rate reaches upward of 50%, years of political unrest have made outsiders skittish to invest in Haiti. Even so, the relationship of outsiders to Haiti has been fought from the beginning. The healthcare system is broken. The education system is broken. It's not the Haitians' fault. They were at a disadvantage from the time of independence onward. This is what Sister Junie Donner, American sister of the Humility of Mary, told me. She manages a medical depot at one hospital in Port-au-Prince. By that she means that even after independence from France, outside influence, whether it was the French seeking indemnities for property lost during the Haitian Revolution that ended in 1804, or the U.S. ruling Haiti in the 1915 to 1934 occupation, has not helped Haiti at all. In fact, it has probably crippled it. Haiti has been paying for its independence for a very long time, Bouvier said. The result is frustration at all levels. The cost of hunger, malnutrition, and a lack of education are considerable, said Sister Janet Lehman, who directs a nursing program at the University of Notre Dame's Haiti's Jacmel campus. People die early. And when something like Hurricane Matthew happens, the poor are most affected. Now, last year's hurricane did a lot of damage, a lot of farms, gardens, food orchards, livestock. This was one problem Bouvier told me. But another was massive erosion, covered once fertile seabeds with sand. If the mangroves die, fish reproduction could be harmed in many coastal villages, which rely on deep fishing opportunities for food and income. So on top of long-standing problems, trauma inflicted by Hurricane Matthew has only made matters worse. One problem Haiti has been, and this is also a problem with South Sudan, as we'll see. One problem that Haiti has faced for many years is a dependence on imported food, particularly rice from the U.S., a dynamic that has long troubled many Haitians and has been the subject of numerous studies. One such study for the humanitarian organization Oxfam said this: once a special food consumed on Sunday, rice has become the main staple of the Haitian diet, especially among low-income people. Imported rice, according to this study, accounts for the vast bulk, 83% of consumption. Noting that any discussion of food security in Haiti must address this supply of rice, the report concluded that a substantial increase in local production is needed to reproduce dependence on external supplies, particularly given high and volatile international prices, and to improve the incomes of local producers, especially small farmers. The conclusion of such studies doesn't surprise Haitians. The introduction of so much imported food has killed agriculture, Corporal said, adding that long-term Haiti needs to increase its internal production and make food produced in the country more affordable to Haitians. Now, in the short term, the work of Catholic sisters and others is helping many people stave off the worst effects of hunger. There are no better projects than the programs run by the sisters. This is what Angel Aloma, who's the executive director of Food for the Poor, told me. They, the sisters, would be wealthy if they were entrepreneurs. They are so well organized and disciplined. Still, to the sisters, such praise means little in the face of so much unnecessary illness and death. The coffins of infants and small children are a common sight at the chapel on the hospital ground where Sister Donor works. The problem of Haiti is poverty, she said. It's simple. That points to something systematic, stark, and troubling. Evil is black and white in Haiti, she said, and the evil is poverty. The evil is poverty. The evil is poverty. Now that may seem obvious, but it needs to be stated over and over, and that fight to combat hunger is really a fight about fighting poverty. Now that's something I relearned when I spent a good deal this past May, earlier this year, in South Sudan. And when I spent one Saturday morning under a shade tree with residents of the tiny village of Kabu. Their challenges, food shortages, meager crops, rising crime, economic travails, and ethnic tensions, mirror those facing much of South Sudan. Kabu is a tiny place with about 125 families located about 10 miles west of the capital, Juba. It might be considered a microcosm for those areas in South Sudan that have not been laid waste due to famine or to the 4-year civil war, but still face enormous challenges with food security, which again means the availability and access to food. And yet there is a sense of hope, however fragile, in Kabu, which is benefiting from the efforts of the Congregation of Sisters from India to build a greater sense of community. The common goal: grow enough food to sustain the village. It's hard work, but seeing the challenges, well, we take them as stepping stones toward our goal, said Sister Ronnie Mary. She's the one on the left here. She coordinates the food security program for the Daughters of Mary Immaculate, or the DMI sisters. And again, they're an India-based congregation. Resident Jocelyn Tabu praised the sisters' work, saying the sisters are motivating us, in particular for giving women more of a voice within the community. Men and women have an equal say in a farmers' association that consists of 3 groups of about 40 each. The 3 groups cultivate and harvest crops, and when there is food left over, they market it. But there are challenges aplenty in building up the community's food security. You see, the rainy season was late this year, causing delays in planting. Though there was some rain in May and June, in general, the rains so far have been an improvement over last year. The harvest began last month. Still, the dependence on rain, there are no immediate water boreholes near the fields, and only one for the community at large, remains a challenge. More telling, roadside robberies and overall insecurity have made people wary of venturing out to the fields. In late May, several people working in the fields were robbed of cash, cell phones, farm implements, and tools. Even so, the flat land with fields planted with corn, peanuts, and sorghum holds hope despite these setbacks. The land is beautiful, said resident Oliver Andrea. That's true, said resident June Tumble Arasto, but people are living on God's mercy. People are living on God's mercy. That's a refrain you hear a lot, both in South Sudan and Haiti. It's difficult now, very, very difficult. It's not only the land that presents challenges. South Sudan's economy is in tatters. Many people have not been paid their salaries or pensions for months, or even years. Devaluation of the local currency, the South Sudanese pound, is making purchases of food and everyday items like soap and other hygienic necessities a challenge. The country's civil war has exacted a cruel price. As I mentioned earlier, the World Food Program notes that before the conflict, the country was making progress in its fight against hunger. But with at least 1 million people displaced, actually closer to 2 million, either within the country or outside, the country has reversed its progress. In terms of food in Cebu, residents say they're hungry. Once again, people saying they're hungry. Not starving, but hungry. Meaning people are coping with smaller meals, once-a-day meals, or meals without meat or other proteins. Though many people, relief agency officials, locals, and Catholic sisters, say South Sudan has the resources to become relatively self-sufficient to growing its own food, the country has developed an import-based economy in which much of its food comes from neighboring countries, like Uganda. So in this respect, South Sudan shares a characteristic with Haiti. But of course, South Sudan has one very key difference with Haiti, and that's as bad as conditions are in Haiti, and as unstable as things can get, Haiti has not experienced, at least in recent years, a civil war. One thing the War of Independence that ended in 2011 did South Sudan was to make it dependent on imported food. And unfortunately, that dependence on imported food remains. There's also been a shortage of hard currency, like the US dollar, so the South Sudanese have opted to devalue their currency, the pound. As a result, the price of everything in recent years has soared. Vegetables that cost a few pounds a few years ago now cost 50 times that amount. And this is how serious things are in South Sudan. The World Food Program notes that in South Sudan, the most basic plate of food costs 155% of the average daily income. Repeat that. The most basic plate of food costs 155% of the average daily income. The equivalent in New York, and likely Chicago too, would be like paying $320 for a serving of baked beans. $320 for a serving of baked beans. Now, when I met them in May, the DMI sisters affirmed the villagers' complaints about rain and overall difficulties of economic security. There are also the problems of poor roads. That's another characteristic South Sudan shares with Haiti, which make getting tools, tractors, and implements to the farm areas difficult. But the challenges are also deeper in other ways. It is difficult for the sisters to organize communities like Cebu, they said, because of continued problems in uniting people for a common purpose. Ethnic differences remain a key, even outsized part of life in South Sudan. In the case of Cebu, people of different groups, for now, get along in a fairly neighborly way. The people in Cebu are mostly Bari and Mudang people, and many are migrants from other parts of South Sudan and Sudan. But even in Cebu, where the land is owned by members of the Bari tribe, it's hard for many to look beyond loyalty to an ethnic group, especially when the current government is seen as primarily Dinka, the largest single group in the country. Those who are not Dinka say they feel repression or the threat of it, though they are reluctant to mention specifics. Sister Mary told me it's a big challenge to bring people together. In a nation of some 60 ethnic or tribal groups, this isn't surprising. But the continued tension and the ongoing civil war that has uprooted more than 1 million people and has killed hundreds of thousands means that nothing is really settled. Nothing is ever really settled in South Sudan. So things like long-term economic planning or reforms get pushed to the side. If the country is not at peace, everything is in disorder, said Mary. Basic needs don't get met. I'll repeat that. If the country is not at peace, everything is in disorder. Basic needs can't be met. If there's no peace in the country, there can be no peace in the community. Now there's the peace equation again. Without peace and some semblance of stability, the stability that makes it possible to build roads, improve schools, and focus on jobs, fighting hunger becomes that much more difficult. Now many in South Sudan don't believe ethnic tensions are a given, or something set in stone, but are rather things that are exploited and exploited by politicians. Dismissal of politicians is all too common. That's another thread that South Sudan shares with Haiti. Some who are hopeful about their community, but not about the larger political situation in the country. You can't be optimistic listening to the radio, all of the warring parties, said one resident. We don't know what is next. You don't hear anything good about bringing peace. We hope God will intervene and bring peace to South Sudan. Now, let me just add a bit about a war-torn area that I was in the city of Wau, which is in northwestern South Sudan. Kabu, despite all of its problems, is a relatively peaceful place. Wau, by contrast, is a very confusing, unsettled place. The confusion is most apparent in the church-owned grounds adjoining St. Mary's Cathedral. Here, thousands of people have found shelter in the last year, fleeing violence that has torn them from their homes, and in many cases, the small plots of land outside the city that sustain them and their families. The land on the compound, at about 20,000 square feet, is roughly half the size of a football field. Most people arrived from violence last June, but new arrivals have crowded into the compound since April. Exact numbers are still hard to come by, but there may be about 18,000 families in the compound, said Father Moses Peter, a diocesan coordinator for the Catholic Humanitarian Alliance, Caritas. The population taking refuge in St. Mary's Cathedral compound, it fluctuates a lot, said Kenyan Sister Rosemary Odell, a member of the Franciscan Missionary Sisters for Africa, noting that there may have been widely varying headcount numbers. This is her right here, and this on the left here. At the moment, she told me the numbers may be closer to 8,000 people, because some have taken advantage of the rainy season or relative calm to return home, even if only temporarily. But still, the compound is a noisy place. Though like other displacement sites in South Sudan, it has the feel of something permanent, with makeshift shops selling goods as varied as soft drinks and cell phone equipment. In this respect, the compound shares every bit in common with refugee camps. Now, refugee camps, just to be clear, are camps for people who have crossed borders, like into neighboring Uganda. And like in refugee camps, most of the residents in the Wau compound are women and children. This is a universal throughout the world. Women and children bear the brunt of violence and wars. Though men face their own difficulties. In South Sudan, they are in the bush fighting. One of the compound's recent arrivals is Carmela Julio, 47. This is her right here on the right. A widow and mother of 5 who lived about 6 miles away from Dal in a nearby village. She fled with her children April 11th after soldiers broke into their home, looting and ransacking it. She told me we feel safe here. She is still traumatized and doubts she would return home anytime soon to her home or to her village. As someone with a small plot of land back home and with her own business, baking bread and selling peanuts, she would have to start from zero if I returned home. So I don't know what to do. I can't feel safe there. Feeling safe at the compound has its discomforts. Julio and the family sleep outside. I think you can see here the mats. They have a small tent that protects their possessions. The family has staked a spot, but they don't own this land. Of course, they just are there temporarily. Her children, ages 13 to 18, are in school, and she thanks the sisters for their work in providing emergency food packets. But the sisters simply being among those who are waiting it out, talking, listening to stories, saying a blessing is also welcome. Religious in South Sudan call it a ministry of presence. What people have gone through, well, you have to listen, the sister told me. She said this in a moment of reflection and rest under a shade tree of the sister's small compound, which adjoins the larger church compound. During the initial response to the violence, the sisters set up a makeshift clinic, and the sisters continue to provide monthly food parcels to those in the compound. How long the response will be needed is anyone's guess. They are staying here, not going far. If they are coming here and you're running, well, that's not good. I'm here with a mission of God's, Sister Wanda said. Father Peter lays the blame of the problem at the feet of the national government, whose young troops, many of them unpaid and by all accounts undisciplined, have targeted civilians in a maelstrom of violence. The worst violence from last June resulted in hundreds of deaths around Wow. Government troops, members of the Sudan People's Liberation Army, called the SPLA, and many of the members of the Dinka tribe initially targeted non-Dinkas and those opposed to the government. Recent violence in April, though not as intense as last year, still drove hundreds from their homes. Carlo Colon, 71, who like Julio came to the compound in April, said he does not know who committed the violence as he fled his home in Wow at night and can only be sure that people with guns were attacking families. But having returned to his home only once, he saw the residence had been stripped bare. Windows, mattresses, carpets, all gone. This is not his residence, but this is an area affected by violence. Now, the South Sudanese government has said the troops are simply trying to battle an anti-government rebellion, and they've blamed the rebellion on what's happening. Peter said the government has accused the Catholic Church of being pro-rebel. He denies that, saying the Church is acting out of humanitarian convictions. However, most people who stream into the compound say those wearing army uniforms threaten their lives. Nobody trusts the SPLA, Peter said. Whoever is ultimately responsible for the violence, one thing is for sure, the flight of people from their land is exacerbating food needs in rural South Sudan, causing and worsening famine in some areas of the country. Many people came to Wow having cultivated land for years, only to see their land taken over by soldiers. Adding to the problems, Wow has long been a center of conflict between farmers and pastoralists who raise cattle, so the recent violence has only added to already present tensions. The sisters say they have to remain neutral with all parties. The humanitarian response within the compound is no easy thing. In recent months, there's only been enough food for 10,000 people, not enough during the time when there were more people in the compound. Father Peter said, we have to be patient. We have to be patient with those who have fled their homes but remain in South Sudan and have not gone to another country. If people return now, they will find their homes not only looted but without a door or iron sheet remaining, he said. It's not sustainable in any short-term or long-term way, the sister told me. It's very frustrating. Something is preventing the people from going back. They will have to be relocated at some point or given their livelihoods in some way. Peter said the situation may last for years and will only be solved when the warring parties, particularly the national government, make peace a priority. Again, peace connection. Sister Odell told me, I struggle with the situation, the sense of God being present. I struggle with that. It sometimes throws me off, she said. Sometimes I'm angry with God. In these circumstances, I find it hard going. But when all is said and done, as we settle down and listen to God in prayer, what is He telling us? I see the shortness of my life, the demands of my life, the demands my way of life, ask me. She paused. To make the choice to stay as a sister, that's not easy. The struggle goes on. I have concluded that this is what God asks for us at the moment, so I rely on Him. This is the way God wants it. There's a sense of surrender. Yet being realistic about the dangers around her dictates tact, care, and something of a cool, objective eye about the situation a while. In an environment where the air of night and the air of day might be still now, but chaotic tomorrow, Odell said, right now, I'm very careful, maybe too careful, with my hope. Being careful with hope. What does that mean? When I began my reporting career early in the 1980s, a time when wars were raging in Central America, much was made, often derisively, about the influence of liberation theology. A theology that probably has as many definitions as there are advocates and critics. However, one of the simplest of its definitions is that there's a Christian obligation to battle economic, social, and racial injustice. In the realm of economic matters, we now see the Catholic Church's avowal of a preferential option for the poor, an option now championed quite vocally by Pope Francis, and who surely is representative of the very best Catholic tradition of Corporal Works of Mercy, such as feeding the hungry and giving drink to the thirsty. Though let me add again, the sisters, priests, and humanitarian workers I've seen in Haiti and South Sudan are also surely representative of that tradition too. In an epoch in which less than 1% of the world's population controls half of the wealth, and where more than 1/2 of U.S. school children are now said to be poor, Pope Francis has taken a commanding lead in current global discussion about poverty and hunger. That in turn has given other Christian leaders a wider space to speak about inequality and the religious community's commitment to the poor. As just one example, Justin Welby, the Anglican Archbishop of Canterbury, attending a church conference in New York on income inequality recently, was asked in an interview by the New York Times about the issue. He said inequality is partly about those who are excluded and forgotten. Therefore, it becomes an issue about the nature of the value of the human being, the dignity of the human being, which is a religious issue. The human being for whom Christ died is of equal value, whoever they are. Archbishop Welby, like Pope Francis, is a religious leader of the center, not of the left. Both revere tradition, and both have at least partial roots in the conservative wings of their churches. But both are responding to the world as it is, a place of increasing disparities. Disparities we see most glaringly in countries like South Sudan, but there are disparities in many places, including our own country. Certainly, both leaders are calling on those who are better off to recognize and see the challenge that religious traditions pose for people. They aren't merely saying the rich need to be concerned with the poor, though in today's political climate that would be a small victory. I think they're asking for something deeper. What would happen if in the United States we could stop feeling that poverty is something that happens to others? It happens to others in other parts of our communities, happens to people in South Sudan, happens to people in Haiti. And to stop thinking about the poor as other. Many, maybe even most U.S. residents have poverty in their family histories. And more people today are experiencing poverty in their own lives. If we recognize this, perhaps we would have a nation and world where there's slightly more solidarity and empathy. It cannot just be about that, though. It has to be grounded in the wider world, containing a larger and more genuine sense of life itself. It is, at the very least, empathetic, and at its most courageous, trying to change the world concretely, even at the edges. It is as old as the call of the prophets and the message of the gospel. That human agency is an act of holiness. Feeding the hungry, helping the hungry, advocating for and with the hungry is a fight worth taking. In short, the struggle for human dignity, including the quest for food, land, and just plain simple fairness, continues around the world. The poor are dying before their time because poverty means death, unjust and early death, says theologian Gustavo Gutierrez. The poor are a byproduct of the system in which we live and for which we are responsible. They are marginalized by our social and cultural world. They are the oppressed, robbed of the fruit of their labor and despoiled of their humanity. Hence, the poverty of the poor is not a call to generous relief action, but a demand that we go and build a different social order. Now, some people would call Gutierrez's language dated. It's bound to a particular time of social unrest. And yet today, talk of social change seems more palatable to me than any time in my life. Worries over social inequality, food disparities, and hunger are more widespread than ever. For those of us who are alert to the problems of the world, who care about places like Haiti and South Sudan, and that would include, I think, everyone in this room, the ability to do good, or at least do better, is in our hands. Let me finish with a quote from Pope Francis. Let's let the Holy Father have the last word. As he has said, peace, hunger, war climate change, these are all related issues. And whatever we do to combat one of these will help combat the others. The struggles will continue well into our lifetimes, and the fight must continue if we consider ourselves a moral species. That's me. Now we'll give Francis the last word. Hunger and malnutrition can never be considered a normal event to which one must become accustomed, as if it were part of the system. Something has to change in ourselves, in our mentality, in our societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. We'll have a little bit of time for discussion. I first want to ask Howard Rosing, who's here. Howard is our local expert on food policy, has written extensively on it, and has degrees in anthropology with a particular emphasis on food policy. He's the director of the Stain Center for Community Service here, and I've just asked him to give a short 5-minute response, kind of bringing Chris's comments about Haiti and South Sudan home here to Chicago.
Great, thanks a lot. Another guy between you and the Cubs. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the invitation. So I'm going to reflect just really quickly on 5 areas that I think are important, and then we can, I think, have discussion and questions. One is what I think Chris's work does is it brings forth the faces of hunger. The second thing is that I'm going to talk about is the connection of this to Chicago. Thirdly, I would like to sorry, losing my place here. I want to talk about the relationship to engagement, particularly around the issue of displacement and how we here at DePaul may think about engagement on the issue of hunger. And then lastly, I want to return to the island where I've done a lot of work, especially on the Dominican side, also with Haitians, but where we are currently working on the border with students, and talk a little bit about that. So I think the faces of hunger issue that comes to light with Chris's work really reminded me, in particularly around the global nature of issues of food insecurity. And I think it's important, and I think this is why it's so important to have writers like Chris to tell the story of people who are experiencing these situations. And I also noticed his sense of optimism, which I think is really important in light of all these places that he seems to have gone and documented all these incredible challenges. And I really appreciate, I'm going to return to this question of optimism in a moment. I want to think about this within the context of DePaul and its Catholic connection to engaging in food systems, and particularly around the redevelopment of food systems, and the sense that he also brought into the work of how humanitarian engagement among this network of Catholic NGOs across the world and groups, how DePaul is a part of that. We're the largest Catholic university in the country, and of course we need to be a part of that network, and we are in some places, and we need to continue to think of ourselves as part of the network that he's documenting. That brings me to the question of Chicago. And by no means am I going to make an analogous argument between South Sudan, which I know very little about, Haiti, which I know a lot more about, and Chicago, because there are degrees of difference as it relates to food insecurity. But I just want to remind people that 1 out of 7 people in Cook County are food insecure. Some communities, more than 50%, are food insecure in our city. Many of the households do not qualify for federal assistance. The SNAP program, Supplemental assistance nutrition program, which is by also being cut regularly, significantly. So there's reasons why those households that are food insecure do not qualify, but that is kind of a part of the challenge here. How do we begin to link this to the question of displacement? So I want to think about displacement as not necessarily in the short term of history, or contemporary issues of forced migration or refugee displacement, but think about it in terms of the long term, and how our city is made up of a lot of people and how the Chicago area is made up of a lot of people who are displaced. And I'm not just talking about refugees. So a few years ago I was in Hattiesburg, Mississippi at a conference on community engagement in a large hall giving a talk to a predominantly white population in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, which is not a big population. And I was giving a talk on food deserts in Chicago. Food deserts is a USDA defined term since 2009, and I was giving a talk about it. And there was a lot of sort of strange looking faces in the audience kind of looking at me like, why is he talking about food deserts in Chicago at this conference in Hattiesburg, Mississippi? And I had to put up a map to show them the sort of line between Hattiesburg and Chicago, because many of their former residents live in Chicago, and many of them live in food deserts. And so when we think about displacement, we have to think of in what the French Academy calls the longue durée, the long-term historical and structural displacement of people and how that affects food insecurity in the long term. So thinking about that in Chicago, we have, okay, so Chris mentioned 50% of the population of Haiti is undernourished and 50% is unemployed. Haiti itself is a food insecure state. It imports more food than it produces. It produces more than 50% of the food that it consumes. In the neighborhoods of Fuller Park, Riverdale, and Englewood in Chicago, we have rates of unemployment close to 50%. We have rates of food insecurity over 50%. And so it's in our midst as the largest Catholic university in the country to think about these things, I think. And I think we need to think about them through a racial equity lens. Particularly because this is a map I showed for my students in my community food systems class. The food desert map of Chicago is the map of Black and African American demographics of Chicago. It's equal. And so it is important for us, and I think Chris's work points to this, that there's a racial equity question here globally, and certainly it's reflected in the city of Chicago. Okay, my last point, engagement. Chris did an excellent job, and his book, from everything I can tell, I haven't read it fully yet, does an excellent job at looking at the Catholic response. What can DePaul do is the question I come up with every day that I'm teaching and working at the Stain Center here at DePaul. So through my work with students and through the work that I have done engaging with food systems in the city of Chicago, I think one of the things we can do is begin to re-educate youth about the food system. Now, I don't necessarily mean teaching youth about what's good to eat, what's healthy. What I mean is re-engaging our education system around teaching youth around the production and distribution systems, not only how to produce food, but the policies and influential behaviors of different corporations and others that are affecting food access in the city and in the country and in the world. So it's a multifaceted, practical and theoretical type of education around food production and distribution with youth. I particularly think that is the future if we're going to be thinking about resolving food insecurity. It's not this generation, it's the youth who are going to be engaged in that process. How do we get them to start thinking about what an equitable food system looks like where people have access? And how do we get them to understand that question of race is also critical, especially in a city like Chicago. I think what can be done here at DePaul is some of the things we're already doing. Faculty, students, staff, community members who are here, you should know that at DePaul we have a network of assets across the city. People who are working on local food systems, redevelopment in the city and in the region. Sort of reclaiming the city in a way for production and distribution. Many with a racial equity lens. Working at the structural level then to rebuild the food system is a long-term process. I'm not suggesting that we stop providing aid and all those kinds of things. That's extremely important in our sort of, especially Vincentian tradition. We do not want to walk by people who are hungry and not engage with them. But the long-term process of redevelopment of the food system is going to involve us working, especially with youth, in specific types of projects. And there are already people working on that. We don't have to invent the wheel to do that. Faculty teaching can involve this in their courses. And students, if you are here, guess what? We have funding to provide you with money to do internships with these folks in the city. And so see me if you're interested. Last point. Did I say I was going to give a last point? This is the last point. I also work in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, as I said. Thinking about the island, which I spent the last 20 years working in, I lived there for over 2 years. Much of the food system on the island of Hispaniola is the product of Haitian labor. The entire agricultural sector in the Dominican Republic is dependent on Haitian labor. 90% of the labor that produces the rice that goes into Haiti to feed people is produced by Haitians themselves on the Dominican side. The questions around Haiti itself returning to food security have to do with deep understanding of the ecology of Haiti. It is an ecological mess. That started with the overproduction, long-term overproduction of sugar under the French colonial regime. I will not go into that. That will take me literally an hour to discuss. The long-term food service recovery security question in Haiti will take a long-term ecological restoration process. It was Clinton who dumped the rice in Haiti. He apologized for it on television after the earthquake, right? Majorly impacting the Haitian farmers. And the long-term impact of imported food now is taking even a larger toll. But it's not just rice, which is not very nutritional, by the way. It's good for some things, you know, like if you're sick. But it's really the protein question is critical, and bean production requires long-term ecological restoration of farms to produce protein, and beans are the most important protein on the island. So what I would say is, if you're interested in that, students here, we have a program on the border of Haiti. Faculty, if you're interested in engaging down there, community members, if you can come along, we'll hopefully try to find a way. We are working with the only school in all of the Caribbean to teach organic sustainable agriculture. It's a public high school on the border in the mountains in a town called Rio Limpio that teaches Dominican students, and as of this year, they are enrolling Haitian students. It's right on the border, you can walk across, to learn about how to do sustainable organic agriculture. If you look across the border, it's really like the moon on the Haitian side. Anybody who saw Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, the first one, may remember that map that he showed of Hispaniola. and really the critical line between the two countries and how you see the deforestation through satellite. So I'll end with suggesting that there are ways to engage here in Chicago, in places like Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and DePaul will help you find a way to engage, and I'm really happy to talk to you more about that. But let's have a discussion about this with Chris. Thanks.
We've got about 15 minutes for questions. If you do have a question, this is being recorded. We just ask you to come to the microphone there and speak into the microphone. And
let me just show there were just a few more slides.
I think we got a question.
Okay, I was just going to say, this is a sign for peace in Juba, the capital of South Sudan. There are efforts, large and small, to create peace. And this is just a bumper sticker which just shows the action in that city of Wow that I was talking about by the Catholic Diocese. So.
Actually, this is more in the form of a comment than so much of a question. And we touched upon the food desert, particularly in Chicago. And I was away from Chicago for about 35 years, and I moved back here. And one of the first things I noticed was the obesity problem among African Americans. And I thought to myself, my goodness, what's happened here from my generation to the next generation, where these people are, a great deal of them are not only more obese, but morbidly obese. There's also a crisis in Chicago among African Americans with diabetes and kidney failure. So I'm really happy to see that maybe there is a beginning to really do something about the food desert, because the conclusion I reached just traveling around the South Side was that many of these people couldn't eat healthy if they wanted to, because there's no place to shop. And I think Mariano's has started to fill the gap in a little bit. And so I'm really very happy to see that, some of that coming to fruition. I'm deeply troubled by the situation in Haiti and how such a small percentage of the population can control so much wealth, and yet the government says they can't operate the country without taxes because the other people aren't working. Why aren't these people paying their share of the taxes? And again, it goes back to the corruption that has been tolerated in Haiti for so many years.
Sure. Let me just say on the food desert question, it's always interesting to live in New York and see how neighborhoods change. But for years there was this food desert dynamic in Harlem. Well, now Harlem has become, as I think everyone knows, more white, and there's no longer a food desert. There are Whole Foods in Harlem, so that's this issue of quote unquote gentrification adds another layer to this. But yes, it is a big problem.
And Whole Foods did come to Inglewood, and and people were applauding that. But I work every day, and I can barely afford to eat it. People call it whole paycheck.
Right.
So I didn't think that was going to scratch the surface. And the other thing too, really quickly, is that when we're talking about re-engaging and re-educating, the people who really are at the poverty level and who competitiveness is
Andy recording.
Okay.
All right. I have a question for you, actually. Unfortunately, I missed part of your lecture. My bad luck, I guess. But I know you addressed the food issue, lack of food. My question is, where does water come into play if there's access to clean drinking water, both in Haiti and in Sudan?
Oh, that's a whole other topic. But my work hasn't focused on that. Other people have done that, but just to say that is absolutely that's a big issue, and it goes hand in hand with food. I can't really speak to that issue specifically, but I want to affirm that yes, that goes hand in hand with trying to develop sources of food. Absolutely.
I have a question about international organizations, especially the United Nations, but also large governments such as the United States or the European Union. What beneficial impact, if any, have they had through any developmental processes in Hispaniola, Haiti, or South Sudan? What efforts are they making, if any, to benefit the people there and to address the issue of civil war and hunger?
Well, let me say, the UN, part of my job with Global Sisters is to cover the UN. I've been doing it 2 years. The UN is still, after 2 years, I still can't get quite a handle on it. It's just, it's such a big, sprawling network of agencies, and that's really what it is. It is a network of agencies. In both places, there are peacekeepers, and in both countries there has been violence. Obviously, that's a big problem in South Sudan right now. One thing they've done in terms of the peacekeeping is in South Sudan they actually run camps. They call them protection of civilian POC camps. There are 2 of them in Juba. I think there's 7 all total in the country. So the UN actually runs those. I think that's a good thing. The World Food Program, throughout the World Food Program provides food in emergency situations or in situations where if it looks like a famine is about to start. The World Food Organization does bring in food. So I think certainly the World Food Organization has done good work. The peacekeepers, that's another story. There's controversy, particularly in Haiti. The UN is not liked in Haiti. The peacekeepers are thought to be responsible for bringing in cholera to Haiti, which the people bringing it in, the soldiers from other countries, they could withstand cholera, but of course people in such a weakened condition in Haiti, there were particularly about, what was it, 2 or 3, 4 years ago, there were a lot of cholera cases in Haiti. There's still, that's still a problem. But just to say, in Haiti, the UN is not viewed very well because of that introduction of cholera. In terms of other agencies, you know, I do want to put in a plug, and I'm not just saying this because of my current job covering sisters, but in my previous life, I worked for a church called Service, which is a humanitarian organization based in New York. It's Protestant based. They did good work. They did good work, but the particular Protestant support for agencies like that is diminishing just because the Protestant churches are losing members. I think the Catholic agencies I have seen, and I'll say again, the Catholic Sisters, CRS, and Jesuit Refugee Service, I think all do commendable work, and I think they can be trusted. That issue comes up a lot because, in our interconnected world, in our world in which news carries so quickly, people are wise to the ways of humanitarian agencies now. And so, for example, the world knows more about the Red Cross and its failings. I wouldn't give a cent to the Red Cross, but I would for the network of Catholic agencies that I mentioned. I'll also say, in terms of the humanitarian work of the sisters, it's often very small scale, but it gets to the people the sisters work with. So I think the sisters in particular can be trusted. But overall, I think the Catholic agencies do a good job.
That actually, Tim, I want to just make a quick plug. Beth Kenobi is here from Catholic Relief Services here in Chicago. So maybe after your question, Tim, I'll give Beth the last word, and she can say a little bit about what CRS is doing and how people can get involved if they're interested.
The question that I had was related to corporate involvement with respect to Haiti, with respect to South Sudan, and with respect to other areas related to hunger from 2 perspectives. Do we see food-based organizations, the Monsantos involved in these areas, and if we do, could you characterize some of their work? And then I'm thinking of other large corporations that have historically done work. Unilever comes to mind in terms of multinationals that have worked around the world. are they doing anything, or is there any involvement from a corporate perspective in these areas of hunger?
Sure. I'll say that that's not an area I know a lot about, but I can say in both cases. First, South Sudan. Another paradox about South Sudan, and again, there's just so much going on in South Sudan, we couldn't hit all the bases, so to speak. But their oil in South Sudan, of course, is that's a big part of what is happening. Now, a lot of that oil is actually going north to Sudan, which is kind of an odd paradox because they were at war for so long. But that's one area where there is obviously a corporate presence. In Haiti, I haven't heard, that's interesting about Monsanto, I haven't heard Monsanto in reference to Haiti, but it wouldn't surprise me if they were there. I will say, because of the, what was it, the political unrest in Haiti about, who was president, was it Clinton? Yes, when Clinton was president. When President Aristide was head of the country, there was a lot of back and forth. There was a lot of political unrest. A lot of corporations left Haiti, and I've heard some people, it's funny, even people I know and respect on the left, saying these garment industries might do Haiti some good, just because there are no jobs. Now, I'm just saying I've heard that. That still strikes me as something I can't imagine in the long term would help Haitians. In the short term, it might, but long term, I can't believe that it would help. So, I wish I knew, that's a good question though. I wish I knew more about the corporate involvement in both places.
No, just anecdotally, or not, you talk about jobs, and in the past, I think of other countries who've been poor where as they come up, education is in trying to foster education in countries.
Sure,
So
that's what the sisters certainly emphasize, yeah.
right, and to get them into, say, the States to go to college and then bring back their skills back to the home country. How open is the U.S. to Haiti, for instance, to that kind? Is it hard to get visas to come and get education, or are the Haitians even interested in that, getting the education to do that? I know it's kind of a broad thing, but when you talk about jobs, I think about education, empowering them.
Well, the current administration has indicated, I'm not sure, maybe someone can help me here, they're not looking very favorably on people who left Haiti, who were left Haiti and staying in the U.S. but had temporary status. I don't know where that stands right now, but the Trump administration was considering throwing people out. I think that says to me that the U.S. current administration is not going to be very receptive to people from Haiti coming. I have heard anecdotally, one of the sisters, I met the sister from Jacmel, her congregation was sponsoring a young Haitian who wanted to be educated in New Jersey. Someone I knew who actually helped me on my latest trip, a young man who was helping me with translation, he was able to get a visa to the U.S. to travel. He did. He returned to Haiti. I mean, he wanted to see relatives. So things happen, but I think that's pretty rare. I think if you're Haitian, it's pretty hard to get a visa. Yeah. So let me just say one thing about this issue of education. I've heard a number of sisters in a number of countries sort of shake their heads, not about educating girls or young women, but the education of boys and young men, because so many of these political leaders have been educated in Catholic institutions, and Catholic social teaching does not seem to affect the men. One man, the sister just won, Marilyn Lacey, she just won an award, it was the Opus Award, it's a big humanitarian project. She works in Haiti and South Sudan, and one of the bishops in South Sudan said something to the effect, "I'm through with educating men. From now on, the focus should be on educating young girls, young women, because there's a chance for peace there." He said he's given up on the men. So anyway, that's, yeah. So.
DePaul, we're not ready to give up on the men.
No. I'm just repeating what I heard. That's all.
Beth, do you want to have the last word?
Sure. Thank you so much to both of you for your remarks tonight. And I'm grateful to Bill and the Center for World Catholicism for giving me the last word, but I feel like you've said so much and highlighted, even without mentioning Catholic Relief Services, your values and the principles that you stand for really resonate with our work around the world. I want to make just a couple of comments about food security. And one is that often I think when people think of food insecurity, the image that comes to mind is the World Food Program and helicopters dropping big bags of rice. And while that is certainly true in places like Haiti and South Sudan, where there are major natural disasters and major emergencies, we do direct food aid, and often the World Food Program is working through faith-based organizations like Catholic Relief Services because we have this extensive network on the ground. But the other reality and the issue that we're very much aware of is that there is the reality of creating food dependency on developed countries like the United States, or by sending in, whether it's rice or corn or soybeans, we actually do more harm because it displaces the local economy, especially where there may already be food available. It's a tremendous part of our analysis when we're going in and doing emergency relief, especially after a natural disaster. So a place like Nepal, after the earthquake hit, we did very little direct food aid because there were places in Nepal where markets could be opened within a matter of days or weeks. We were much more likely to use cash vouchers so people could go into the market, have the dignity of choice to buy what they needed, but then it would also reinforce and reinvigorate the local economy. The other thing that we often do with direct food aid is to pair that with some kind of economic development program. We do direct food aid in Burkina Faso, but it is part of a women's education and women's empowerment program. So women are coming into centers where they're learning sewing skills, creating small businesses. They get food to take home to their families, but they're also given a network of support with the hope that they don't become dependent on that food aid, but they're able to create a small business, begin to make money for themselves, and be able to purchase food. And then the other example, I met with a colleague from Zambia not too long ago, and she is part of our food security team in Zambia, and she said, we have severe malnutrition in parts of Zambia, not because of a lack of food, but because of a lack of nutritious food. They have an overabundance of corn in their food system, and because of that overabundance and because of other cultural factors, children aren't getting the nutrients that they need. So our project there is really about reintroducing other kind of fruits and vegetables like pumpkin leaf, like sweet potatoes, things that are natural to their habitat, and doing things like cooking classes and showing women in small villages how to plant differently and how to reincorporate those fruits and vegetables into their diets. And they do see a significant difference in a very short amount of time. It's a very interesting parallel to the question that was asked earlier in Chicago, where you see the opposite effect: obesity, diabetes, kidney disease. It's not because of a lack of food, but a lack of nutritious food and access to food. All sorts of wonderful ways that students at DePaul and people in the Chicago community can continue to be part of hunger awareness and hunger education. Again, I'll stick around afterwards as well and would be happy to share what our CRS student ambassadors and our CRS interdisciplinary committee is doing here on campus. And I want to, as Chris was talking and asked that really provocative question about hope and being careful with my hope, I was reminded of this quote from St. Augustine. It was the tagline on an email from a friend of mine just the other day, and it says, "Hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain as they are." So I hope that we leave you with a sense of hope tonight, of both anger and courage, to know that we can change the reality going forward. Thank you.
And let me just say one brief thing about, I kept pounding this idea about fighting for peace, fighting for justice, that fighting for food, those are all the same thing. But underlying this, and what, I wasn't trying to be flip about this issue about educating women as opposed to educating men, but I really do think the hope in a lot of the world is to empower women. That is absolutely necessary, and women carry the burden in countries like South Sudan and Haiti, but if they were empowered more, I think both places would be in much better shape. So I just want to underline that as a very strong footnote to what I said: empower women, and go Cubs.
All right.